Nobody in that glass building knew who Jonathan Hale really was. In the lobby, between turnstiles and white light, he looked like just another displaced employee. Discreet wheelchair, unmarked shirt, temporary badge hanging crooked. The kind of presence that eyes pass through without stopping. And that was exactly what he wanted to feel. The elevator rose in silence, reflecting his face in the polished steel. Jonathan stared at his own reflection like someone staring at a stranger, without the expensive suit, without the owner's posture, without the security that a famous last name offers. There, on that executive floor, he was nobody. And there was a cruel relief in that idea, as if, for a few minutes, the world was finally speaking the truth, because Jonathan had heard everything, but almost nothing was real. Compliments born from fear, laughter that came from interest. Automatic agreements in meetings where nobody had the courage to disagree. The company grew, contracts exploded, assets made headlines, and still, conversations became empty. Nobody saw him anymore. They only saw what he could offer. 3 months ago, during a gala dinner where everyone laughed at his mediocre jokes, Jonathan realized something frightening. He couldn't remember the last time someone had disagreed with him. Not because he was always right, but because nobody dared. That's when that blind meeting case emerged. Officially, a profile evaluation for an internal project. Someone from upper management would choose a new name to integrate into a strategic initiative. In practice, for Jonathan, it was a chance to test something he could no longer measure: character. He wanted to discover how he would be treated when there was nothing to gain. The meeting room smelled of reheated coffee and industrial air conditioning. Jonathan arrived 15 minutes early, as always. He adjusted a simple folder on the table, aligned a blue Bic pen next to a logoless notepad. The wheelchair creaked softly when he settled into the corner of the rectangular table. He hated the sound, not for what it represented, but for knowing that, in that environment, any fragility becomes a label before it becomes conversation. The door opened with surgical precision at 9 o'clock. Victoria Brooks entered like someone entering conquered territory, high heels marking territory on the floor, tablet against her chest, a gaze that swept the room in 2 seconds and catalogued everything. Furniture, lighting, the person in front of her. She greeted Jonathan with a professional smile. That smile that works in corporate photos and creates no intimacy. "Good morning. You must be the candidate for the Sigma project," she said, extending her hand without really looking at him, already pulling the chair from the other side of the table. Jonathan shook her hand. Firm, quick, perfunctory. "Jonathan." "Pleasure." Victoria Brooks, Director of Strategic Operations. She sat, crossed her legs, opened the tablet in a fluid gesture. "Let's get straight to the point. I have 3 other meetings today, and I prefer to optimize everyone's time." She didn't wait for a response. She began talking about the project as if reading a memorized script. Growth targets, team integration, expansion into new markets. Numbers that sounded impressive, delivered in a tone that sounded empty. Jonathan quickly noticed the pattern. She asked without really asking. She threw out questions and answered half of them before he could open his mouth. She subtly interrupted, redirected, controlled. She explained basic concepts with condescending patience, as if Jonathan needed to be guided by the hand at each step. "The organizational structure here is complex, so I'll simplify it for you," she said at one point, leaning slightly forward. "Basically, we have 3 layers of management that—" Jonathan let her talk. He responded calmly, short sentences, neutral tone. He observed. He wanted to see how far her reflex would go when she thought she was facing someone without power, without influence, with nothing to offer beyond technical competence. Inside, an old weariness stirred. It wasn't anger, it was memory. He had been on the other side of the table, 20 years ago, young, trying to prove his worth, being measured by appearances, interrupted, underestimated. The difference was that, now, he was there by choice. And it still hurt. Maybe it hurt more, because now he knew exactly what that meant. At a specific moment, when Victoria was explaining for the 3rd time a concept he had already understood the first time, Jonathan decided to test the limits. "What if we inverted the structure?" he interrupted gently. Victoria blinked, surprised by the break in rhythm. "What do you mean?" "Instead of vertical integration, create horizontal cells with decision-making autonomy. Eliminate intermediate layers. Give more power to the ends. Measure results, not process." Silence. Victoria stared at him for the first time, truly. Not as protocol, but as someone recalibrating the reading of a situation. It was a clean, intelligent idea that tied operational efficiency with human engagement, in a way that didn't match the role he pretended to represent. "Interesting," she said slowly, and there was something in the tone that Jonathan recognized, the discomfort of someone who realizes they underestimated someone. "I'll consider that." But before the conversation could evolve, the door opened again, without knocking, without warning, like a stumble in the perfect choreography. Emily Carter entered in a rush, arms overloaded with folders, a laptop precariously balanced, headphones hanging around her neck, forehead furrowed like someone running against their own lateness. When she realized there were people in the room, she froze in the doorway. Some papers escaped from her arms and slid across the polished floor like clumsy skaters, spreading colorful graphs and hand-scribbled notes. "Oh my God, sorry," she let out, her voice mixing nervousness and genuine embarrassment. She threw herself to the floor without elegance, trying to collect everything at the same time, laughing that nervous way we do when we want the earth to open up and swallow us. A folder fell again. The laptop almost slipped. She cursed softly, something between laughter and despair. Victoria sighed, short, sharp, surgical. "Perhaps it would help to check the schedule before invading meetings, Emily." It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The tone carried that professional acidity that leaves a mark without needing volume. Emily bit the inside of her cheek, swallowing the urge to disappear. As she bent down to pick up the last sheet, she hit her knee on the corner of the table and closed her eyes for a second, breathing deeply like someone saying, "Hang on, just a little more." Jonathan saw everything. The sequence of small disasters, the silent humiliation, the effort to maintain composure. And he also saw what Victoria didn't see. Emily wasn't careless. She was overloaded. There was a difference. Then something happened. When Emily finally stood up, papers organized in an awkward embrace, her gaze fell on Jonathan's wheelchair. For a fraction of a second, he prepared for the usual reaction. The look of pity, or the look that pretends not to see, or the excess of performative solicitude. But it was none of that. Emily simply pulled the table a few centimeters to the side, opening space, in a completely automatic gesture. There was no performance. There was no audience. It was a human gesture, instinctive, the kind that only exists when we're not thinking about how we'll be perceived. Jonathan felt something move inside his chest. A strange sensation, almost forgotten. It wasn't about the wheelchair. It was about her instinct. She hadn't asked about his position. She hadn't evaluated his worth. She had simply seen someone and reacted with basic decency, something that, in Jonathan's world, had become surprisingly rare. Emily prepared to leave, murmuring another apology. "Really sorry. The system marked this room and I didn't check properly." But before closing the door, she looked at Jonathan again. Not with pity, not with invasive curiosity, with something he couldn't quite name. Presence, like saying, "It's okay, I'm here, it happens to everyone." And for a fragile and dangerous second, Jonathan felt his own plan slip from his hands. The meeting tried to resume its rhythm, but the climate had changed. Victoria returned to the script with a slightly greater rigidity, as if she needed to reaffirm control over a room that had momentarily escaped her domain. Jonathan responded, but part of his attention had been caught by that simple gesture that nobody there seemed to have considered significant. A few minutes later, the door opened again, this time carefully, with prior knocking. Emily appeared in the opening without entering completely, holding the laptop against her chest like a shield. "Sorry to interrupt again. The system marked this room for 2 simultaneous meetings. System error, not mine," she made sure to clarify, looking directly at Victoria. "Can I use the other half of the table, or would you prefer I leave?" Victoria made an impatient gesture with her hand, without disguising her annoyance. "You can stay." But no interruptions. Emily entered and settled at the opposite end of the table, occupying the smallest space possible, almost apologizing for existing. She opened the laptop, connected headphones, and began working in silence. Jonathan returned to talking with Victoria, but now there was someone there, a peripheral presence that modified the room's dynamics in a subtle way. 10 minutes later, Victoria was explaining a complex logistical problem, something about resource distribution between departments, when Jonathan noticed Emily frown. She had removed one headphone and was clearly listening to the conversation, even while pretending not to. Then suddenly Emily spoke. "Sorry, I shouldn't butt in, but if the problem is synchronizing deliveries between teams with different time zones, why not create a mandatory overlap window? Like 3 hours a day where everyone is online at the same time and the rest of the day is asynchronous." Victoria turned her face slowly, eyebrow raised. "We're in a private meeting, Emily." "I know. Sorry." Emily made a face. "It's just that I spent 6 months trying to solve this exact problem on the Atlas project, and that was the only thing that really worked." Silence. Jonathan looked at Emily with renewed attention. It wasn't just the idea, which was good. It was the form, direct, practical, without flourish. She wasn't trying to impress. She was trying to help. "Makes sense," Jonathan said, breaking the silence. "Eliminates bottleneck without increasing rigidity." Victoria was visibly uncomfortable. She began reformulating the idea, adding layers of complexity, trying to regain intellectual control of the room. "Yes, well, it's an approach that can work in certain contexts, but it needs to be adapted for more complex structures, considering governance variables." Emily didn't argue. She simply returned to her laptop, but Jonathan had seen what he needed to see. Victoria controlled narratives. Emily solved problems. The meeting extended beyond what was planned. Victoria eventually needed to leave for another commitment, leaving the room with firm steps and a "we'll continue this later" that sounded more like a threat of future control than a promise of collaboration. Jonathan stayed. Emily did too. She began collecting her things, organizing papers with a meticulousness that contrasted with the mess of her arrival. "Sorry for disrupting your meeting," she said without looking at him, putting the laptop in her worn backpack. "You didn't disrupt it," Jonathan responded. "Actually, your idea was the best part of the conversation." Emily raised her eyes, surprised. She smiled sideways, a small but genuine smile. "I bet Victoria doesn't agree." "Victoria doesn't need to agree for it to be true." Emily laughed softly. "That way we laugh when someone says exactly what we were thinking, but didn't have the courage to verbalize." There was a pause, not awkward, just present. "Are you new here?" Emily asked, tilting her head slightly, studying his face with honest curiosity. Jonathan hesitated. The lie was on the tip of his tongue, but there was something in her gaze that made lying harder than it should be. "More or less," he said. "And technically it wasn't a lie." Emily accepted without pressing. She had that rare kind of presence that didn't demand explanations. It just shared space. "Well, if you're going to stick around, a piece of advice: don't take Victoria too seriously. She's competent, but she confuses control with leadership. And—" Emily hesitated, as if deciding whether she should say the rest. "She tends to underestimate people who don't look like her, so don't take it personally." Jonathan was quiet, processing. Emily didn't know she was describing exactly the dynamic he had come to test, but she knew. She lived it. "Thanks for the warning," he said, and there was genuine weight in the phrase. Emily smiled, grabbed her backpack, and turned to leave. But before reaching the door, she stopped. "Do you need help getting to the elevator? This floor is kind of confusing." There was no pity in the question. There was no performance. It was just a simple offer, the kind you make to any person. Jonathan nodded, not because he needed it. He knew that building better than his own house. But because by accepting it, he was admitting something he had avoided for a long time. He was tired of being treated like a title. He wanted to be treated like a person. In the hallway, side by side, the sound of the air conditioning seemed quieter. Natural light hit the panoramic windows, making the concrete and glass seem less cold. Emily didn't fill the silence with forced conversation. She just walked, at his pace, in no hurry to arrive. Jonathan wanted to say something, anything, but each attempt at a sentence died before becoming sound. Not because he didn't know how to speak. Jonathan had given speeches to thousands of people, closed million-dollar contracts at expensive dinners. But it had been so long since someone walked with him, and not behind him, that Jonathan had forgotten how to start a real conversation. It was Emily who broke the silence. "That idea you gave about horizontal cells," she spoke slowly, still processing. "I'd never heard it that way. It made sense. Real sense, you know. Not that PowerPoint sense that looks pretty but doesn't work in practice." Jonathan looked at her, genuinely surprised, not by the compliment. He received compliments every day, but by the form. There was no second meaning. There was no calculation. It was just honest recognition. Thank you," he said, and felt the weight of the word for the first time in years. Emily smiled sideways. "You should have more confidence. Clearly you know what you're talking about. Don't let people like Victoria intimidate you just because she talks louder." Jonathan almost laughed, because the irony was too perfect to be an accident. He was Victoria's boss. He could fire her with an email. And yet, here he was receiving career advice from someone who had no idea who he was. And strangely, that didn't bother him. On the contrary, it made him feel seen. When they reached the elevators, Emily held the door while Jonathan entered. She didn't offer unnecessary help. She didn't make a fuss. She just held it, like you hold a door for anyone. And in that minimal gesture, Jonathan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the desire to stay. Not in the room, not in the meeting, but there, in that hallway, in that shared silence, in that space where he didn't need to be anyone but himself. "Will you be around tomorrow?" Jonathan asked, and his own voice sounded strange to him, vulnerable, hopeful. Emily blinked, surprised by the question. Then she nodded, smiling. "I will. Same confusion, same floor, probably the same wrong room," she laughed. "Why?" "Just curious." Jonathan lied badly. Emily tilted her head, studying him with an expression he couldn't decipher. But she didn't press. "See you tomorrow then, Jonathan." When the elevator doors began to close, Emily waved. A simple wave, without ceremony. Jonathan returned it, and watched her reflection disappear behind the polished steel. And then, alone in that cube of mirrors, Jonathan Hale, owner of a company worth hundreds of millions, a man accustomed to closing international deals and controlling corporate narratives, realized something that scared him. He didn't want this to be a test. He wanted it to be real. In the following days, Jonathan returned to the building. He maintained the disguise, temporary badge, discreet wheelchair, simple shirt. He maintained the safe distance of someone who doesn't want to be recognized. But every time he crossed paths with Emily in the hallway, something changed. She stopped, asked how his day had been, complained about the horrible coffee from the third-floor machine, told stories about an email that was sent to the wrong person and became an inside joke, showed memes that her team shared in a secret Slack group. Small things, things that shouldn't matter, but they did. Because Jonathan realized that those conversations were the only ones where he wasn't representing anything. There was no script, there was no strategic objective, there was no measurable ROI. Just exchange. One afternoon, Jonathan was in the break room alone, looking out the panoramic window at the city he helped build. Emily entered slowly, with 2 cups of coffee in her hands. "Found you here. Brought decent coffee," she offered one of the cups. "That one from the machine is a crime against humanity." Jonathan accepted, surprised. Nobody brought him coffee. Usually it was the opposite, assistants running to get exactly the drink he wanted. "Thank you." Emily sat next to him, sighed, and was quiet for a moment. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was the kind of silence that only works between people who don't need to fill space with empty words. "Can I ask you something?" Emily said after a while. "Sure." "Why are you here?" Jonathan turned his face, confused. "What do you mean?" You're clearly intelligent. You have better ideas than half the directors I know, but you're in this, I don't know, provisional position, like you're testing the waters before diving in. Jonathan felt his heart accelerate. She was dangerously close to the truth. Maybe I'm just trying to figure out where I fit in, he said, choosing words carefully. Emily nodded, thoughtful. I understand. There are days I wonder the same thing, she laughed without humor. If anyone here really sees me, you know, not as a function, not as a name on an org chart, but as a person. Jonathan felt his chest tighten, because he knew exactly what she was saying, and because, ironically, he was there precisely for that, trying to discover if there were still people who saw beyond titles. I know what that's like, he responded, and there was raw truth in those 4 words. Emily turned her face to him, and for the first time, Jonathan saw something in her eyes that he recognized in his own mirror every morning, loneliness disguised as functionality. You seem like someone who really knows, she said softly, and it wasn't a question. Jonathan swallowed hard, because lying there in that moment, with that woman looking at him that way, seemed wrong in a way he could no longer ignore. But he said nothing. He just held her gaze, and for a fragile and dangerous instant, the corporate world disappeared. It was just 2 people, tired, real, trying not to disappear inside their own masks. Emily smiled slightly, sad and beautiful at the same time, and stood up. See you around, Jonathan, she said, and left. Jonathan stayed there alone again, but this time the silence weighed differently, because for the first time in years, Jonathan Hale didn't want to be seen as powerful. He just wanted to be seen. The truth came out on a rainy Monday. Jonathan didn't plan it, didn't choose the moment. It was accident or destiny, or simply the universe collecting the bill for a lie that had lasted too long. He was in the hallway, talking with Emily about a project she was developing, when one of the vice presidents passed by in a hurry, stopped abruptly, and almost shouted, "Mr. Hale, I didn't know you were on this floor. We need to talk about tomorrow's meeting with the investors." The world stopped. Emily froze. She turned slowly to Jonathan, confusion transforming into comprehension, comprehension transforming into hurt. "Mr. Hale?" she repeated, voice low, almost inaudible. Jonathan closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and when he opened them, he saw everything in her eyes: surprise, betrayal, anger, sadness. Emily. You're the owner." She took a step back, as if she needed physical distance to process it. Jonathan didn't respond. He didn't need to. The vice president noticed the atmosphere, muttered an apology, and disappeared quickly. Emily looked at Jonathan as if seeing a stranger. And maybe she was. "All this time," she said, voice trembling, "all this time you were—" "What?" "Testing, playing regular employee. I told you things. I trusted you." "It wasn't like that." Jonathan tried, but it sounded weak even to him. "No." Emily crossed her arms. "Then how was it, Jonathan? You lied about who you were. You let me believe that we had something in common. And the whole time you were analyzing me like I was a lab rat." "I never analyzed you," Jonathan said, and there was desperation in his voice. "I just wanted—" "What?" "To feel what it's like to be normal, to have an authentic experience." Emily laughed, bitter. "Congratulations, you did it, and in the process made me look like an idiot." "Emily, please." "No," she cut him off, and there was firmness in her voice now. "You don't have the right to ask anything from me now." Emily turned and walked away, quick steps, rigid back. Jonathan stood there in the middle of the hallway, surrounded by the building he built, by the company that carried his name, by all the power he had accumulated in 15 years, and felt completely empty. Jonathan didn't try immediate contact. He gave her space. But Emily's absence hurt in a way he wasn't prepared to feel. Work lost meaning. Meetings became noise. Numbers on the screen meant nothing anymore. He had proven his point, discovered that Victoria was exactly what he suspected, competent but opportunistic, and discovered that Emily was genuine in a way he had forgotten existed. But in the process, he had lost the only real thing he had found in years, Until, on a Friday afternoon, Jonathan asked his assistant to schedule a meeting with Emily, not as a boss, as a person who owed a conversation. Emily accepted, not at the office. At a small coffee shop 2 blocks down, where nobody wore badges and nobody talked about targets. Jonathan arrived 15 minutes early, as always. He ordered 2 coffees, left one in front of the empty chair, and waited. Emily entered exactly on time. She sat without ceremony, looked at the coffee, at Jonathan, back at the coffee. "You remembered I take it with oat milk," she said, and it didn't sound like a compliment. "I pay attention," Jonathan responded softly. Silence. Emily stirred the coffee but didn't drink. "Why did you call me here, Jonathan?" "Because I owe you an explanation and an apology. I think you're way past time for both." "I know," he breathed deeply, "and you don't need to forgive me, but I need you to know the truth." Emily stayed quiet, waiting. Jonathan told everything. The exhaustion, the loneliness of never being seen, the test, the plan, and how everything fell apart when he met her. "I came to test other people's character," he said, voice hoarse, "and ended up discovering how much I had lost myself in the process of building all this." He gestured vaguely, as if this encompassed the entire empire. "You made me remember what it is to be human. And I ruined everything because I was afraid of being vulnerable. I was afraid that if you knew who I was, you would change. And then you did change. But not the way I feared. You weren't impressed. You were hurt. And somehow that hurts more." Emily was silent for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was firm but not cruel. "You're right. I did change. Because the person I met, the Jonathan who talked to me in the hallway, who really listened, who laughed at my bad jokes, that guy was real. Or at least I thought he was. And discovering that all of that was part of a test." She shook her head. "It's hard not to feel like I was used." "You weren't used. What I felt was real. It is real." Jonathan leaned forward. "I wasn't pretending when I was with you. I was being more myself than I had been in years. But you were lying about who you were. I was hiding my position, not my character." Emily let out a humorless laugh. "For someone so smart, you have some pretty naive ideas, you know. Position isn't an accessory, it's part of who you are. It changes how people see you, how you see yourself. You can't separate the two things and expect everyone to accept the edited version." "So what do you want from me?" Jonathan asked, and there was real desperation in his voice. "What do I need to do?" Emily stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she spoke. "I don't know if there's a do here, Jonathan. You broke trust. And trust isn't a problem you solve with logic or strategy. It's something you rebuild, slowly, if at all. Are you willing to try?" Silence. Emily took a sip of coffee, made a face. "This coffee is terrible." "I know," Jonathan smiled slightly. "But it's the closest I could get to that coffee from the third-floor machine you always complained about." Emily blinked, and then, surprisingly, laughed. A small laugh, brief, but genuine. "You're impossible. You know that. I know that too." She was quiet, studying his face. Jonathan didn't look away, didn't try to fill the silence with empty promises or corporate arguments. He just waited. Finally, Emily sighed. "I don't know if I can forgive you now, but—" She hesitated. "Maybe I can try to understand why you did what you did, and maybe, with time, we'll discover if there's anything real left under all this mess." It wasn't a yes. It wasn't a happy ending with a soundtrack, but it was an opening. "It's more than I deserve," Jonathan said, and it was true. Emily stood up, grabbed her bag. "We're going to have to go slow, like really slow, and you're going to have to accept that I'm going to distrust everything for a while, because that's the natural consequence of lying to someone." "I accept," Jonathan said immediately. Emily nodded. She started to leave Tags but stopped at the door, looked back. "And Jonathan, next time you want to test someone's character, start by testing your own." She left. Jonathan stayed there, alone, with 2 terrible coffees in a generic coffee shop, in the middle of an ordinary Friday afternoon. and for the first time in years, he felt something he had forgotten how to feel: hope. Emily didn't come back immediately, and Jonathan didn't push. But they started talking. Short emails, practical messages, nothing romantic, just reconstruction. Jonathan made changes in the company, created anonymous feedback channels, implemented a reverse mentorship program where interns mentored executives, promoted people based on competence, not on how much they agreed with him, and he fired Victoria, not out of revenge, but because in the process of re-evaluating everything, he realized that competence without humanity wasn't the kind of leadership he wanted to build. Emily was promoted, but not to Victoria's position, to a new role, Director of Culture and Organizational Experience, with autonomy, with voice, with real power. She accepted, but made it clear it wasn't a favor, it was merit, and Jonathan completely agreed. They started having lunch together, sometimes, when schedules allowed, conversations about work that slipped into conversations about life, about fears, about mistakes, about how hard it is to be human in a world that values masks. One afternoon, coming back from one such lunch, walking side by side through the same hallway where it all began, Emily stopped. "Jonathan." "Yes?" "I think I've forgiven you." Jonathan stopped too, turned to her. "Really? Not completely. There are still days when I remember and get irritated, but I understand why you did it, and I see the effort you're making to be different." Jonathan felt something come undone inside his chest, a knot he didn't even know he was carrying. "Thank you," he said, voice hoarse. Emily smiled. Not that small, sad smile from months ago, a whole smile. "But just for the record, if you lie again, I'm going to destroy you." Jonathan laughed, and so did she. And there, in that hallway of a glass building in the middle of the city, Jonathan Hale understood something fundamental. Power impresses, but it's humanity that sustains. And after 15 years building an empire, he was finally learning to build something more important, a real connection.